Good evening. My name is Rachel Windenberg. I teach 5th through 8th grade at Samuel E. Shull Middle School in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. I've been an art teacher for 27 years. Before that, I studied studio art and art education at Pratt Institute and Montclair State University. Administrators and evaluators want to see us using Bloom's taxonomy in the art room. Lucky for us. The art-making process is a powerful tool for fostering creativity and higher-order thinking skills. Here is a bit of history about Bloom's taxonomy. In the 1950s, a team of educational psychologists, including Benjamin Bloom, observed that very little higher-order thinking was going on in the average American classroom. Instead, students were made to memorize information and spit it back out on demand without necessarily understanding it. This type of learning would correspond to remembering at the bottom of this pyramid. A parallel in the art room would be a, quote, cookie-cutter art project where all the students' projects look identical. The taxonomy was later revised in the 1990s to correspond to the graphic you see here. The basic idea is that once a student gains understanding of a concept, they can apply that knowledge, analyze and evaluate their successes and failures, and go on to use that knowledge to create something truly unique. Using this sort of scientific thinking in the art room can strengthen your students' habits of mind in all subject areas. Once more, they will learn to have fun thinking. In this presentation, I'm going to illustrate how I used toothpick sculptures to foster creativity and higher-order thinking skills in my own students. This whimsical playground was actually created by my own daughter when she was in just 3rd grade, but in the art room I actually ended up doing this project with 6th graders. The magic of using Bloom's taxonomy occurs when each student follows the identical directions, yet each project looks unique. And connections are made. Why am I showing you a picture of snowflakes? What is the connection between ice crystals and toothpick sculptures? And how did my students discover such a connection? More about that later. First, I want to get to the thinking process we used, how I taught the lesson. How do we combine scientific reasoning with design thinking? To answer that question, we need to look at how the most successful artists and designers think. Quote, "Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem, the ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, his willingness and enthusiasm for working within these constraints." Unquote. Charles Eames. This whimsical, toy-like machine pictured here was designed by Charles Eames in 1957. It is a solar-powered cause and effect machine and was actually quite innovative. It is one of the earliest devices to transfer solar power into work. At the time, the Eames design firm contacted Stanford University in order to ask their advice about solar-powered machines. Instead of giving the Eames design firm advice, the Stanford University actually sent out a team of engineers to examine this device because nothing like it had ever been created before. So the Eames design firm is actually a perfect example of people using design thinking combined with engineering thinking to create something unique. I reference Eames's work here for several reasons. He was famous for applying scientific reasoning to design problems. His work had a childlike, colorful, simple whimsy to it, and like our toothpick sculptures, he often designed toys that could be constructed in a variety of open-ended ways using repetitive, modular forms. Now, back to Bloom's taxonomy. I want to talk about how the pyramid works. When a student understands a concept and is able to apply it, this lays the groundwork for analyzing, evaluating, and creating. In other words, lower order reasoning is the foundation for higher order thinking. With that in mind, I gave my students the following design challenge: to work as a team to build the tallest toothpick tower, to apply the design principles of symmetry and balance, to ensure your team builds a sculpture that is stable, will not topple over, and sturdy, will not fall apart. I asked my students, if you were going to design the tallest possible tower, which shape would you start with? Most students picked the cube. So then I asked them, if you took a cube and a tetrahedron and applied pressure, what do you think would happen? Then I gave my students a chance to discuss, present, and test their hypotheses and reflect on their findings. So here you see they're taking squares and squishing them and triangles and squishing them and comparing them. If this process reminds you of the national art standards, creating, presenting, reflecting, and connecting, that's not a coincidence. Note the similarities to the scientific method. Higher order thinking skills look the same across disciplines, and using higher order reasoning will improve student performance across disciplines. So, the kids did a little experiment. 16 balls of clay and 24 toothpicks can look like this, 4 tetrahedrons. Or it could look like this, 2 cubes, same amount of toothpicks, same number of balls of clay. So the question that I wanted my students to investigate is, how can we test which is stronger, triangles or squares, and by extension, tetrahedrons or cubes? Which one holds more weight? The students got into groups and they built tetrahedrons and cubes and they compared them. What they universally found was that the triangle is always the strongest and most stable form. So the next question is, how can we apply what we found to our sculpture creations? Here's the worksheet I gave my students. Materials: white Crayola Model Magic, water-based markers, wooden toothpicks, white glue. Directions: add color to your Model Magic by scribbling on it with marker and kneading the clay. Make small spheres, pea-sized or slightly larger, of the clay and allow them to dry overnight. After watching the videos, create a tetrahedron like the one pictured here. Simply dip each toothpick into a small amount of glue before sticking it into your sculpture. Make your sculpture grow by forming new tetrahedrons. If you keep in mind that the triangle is the strongest shape, you will have more success in building larger forms. Consider symmetry and balance when creating your design. If your design is balanced and symmetrical, you will be able to build a taller structure. Here are some of their creations. It's amazing the variety of designs. This student wanted to build an enclosure, complete with a roof. This team of 6th grade girls worked as a team to create an incredibly tall structure. Once they got to the top of the tower, they wanted to make it still taller, so they brainstormed how they could make the tower taller. They actually ended up turning it on its side and adding increasingly wider stories to the bottom of their building. So in this way, they came up with a unique and creative solution, basically using higher order thinking skills to come up with something that no one told them to do. Each group followed the identical instructions, and yet each sculpture tower turned out completely different from everyone else's. Earlier in my presentation, I showed this slide of snowflakes and mentioned how this project paved the way for my students to make unexpected connections, and I promised to come back to that later, so here's the story. Later in the year, when my students were making snowflakes, we discussed how ice crystals are formed. The crystals grow and the molecules link together, following a specific pattern, and yet every snowflake is different. I asked them if they could think back to another project where everyone used the same building blocks and yet everyone's project turned out completely different. All of a sudden, I got the waving hands and the excitement and the light bulb moment. And that is the beauty of using Bloom's taxonomy in your classroom. This project is just one example. In almost any creative endeavor where the students are given the right combination of structure and creative freedom in the art room, they can be given the opportunity to remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and most of all, to create.